was in 1977. We both studied fine art at Goldsmiths College in London. And so yeah, we met as 20-year-olds, and we've kept in touch ever since. We've been friends for the last 30-odd years. This sort of came about through a third person who kind of came up with the idea, well, why don't you put something together, you know? And we thought, well, yeah, and the work, I think as I said in part of the catalogue, was that at the moment it's a point where our work has come closest than it's ever been, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of times, you know, it's been miles apart, and it's sort of, you know, wavers in and out. And at the moment, you know, I think I described it as the lines on the graph have come the closest that they've ever come, you know. So it was kind of fortuitous that person made that suggestion at this particular time. It was just perfect timing then.
Yeah, I've been working with the designs of William Morris. He's a 19th century designer, English designer, but he's also a novelist. He wrote a very famous utopian novel called News from Nowhere. During his life he was very famous as a poet and translator of Icelandic sagas. He was a sort of general Renaissance man, but he was also very involved in politics, and he was part of the first socialist organisation set up in Britain at the time, Socialist Democratic Federation. And he later started another organisation called the Socialist League. So I was very interested in the relationship between his politics and the work he was doing as a designer of wallpapers and fabric designs. And I sort of am still interested in how they work off each other, what's going on there. So I've been working with his fabric designs and wallpaper designs and overworking them with different sorts of imagery to try and create a dialogue between his designs and his imagery, to try and draw out some of the meanings inherent within his designs. At the moment I'm sort of questioning it by painting over it and deleting parts of it. At the same time I'm drawing back into visibility other parts of it. So it's a matter of a sort of push and pull. So whenever I paint onto it, it's about achieving some sort of balance between obliteration and revelation. So the two things and if I go too far one way or the other, it doesn't work. So if I don't cover up enough, it's just a Morris pattern. And if I cover up too much, well, you can't see it anymore. So it's all about achieving that balance between, yeah, totally deleting it and not having any impact on it at all. Even before I was working with Morris's stuff, I was working with different sorts of fabric designs. And in America, I was working with fabrics produced in the Midwest of America with cowboys and Indians on them and homesteads and typical sort of fabric from that region. And when I came back to England, I wanted to find something that was sort of English, like what is an English fabric? And I thought of Morris, and I'd also read a book about him called From Romantic to Revolutionary, describing his politics. So yeah, I mean, I've always liked working on an existing surface. I've never felt comfortable with working on a blank sheet of paper or a blank canvas. I always like to work off something that already exists.
Yeah.
Politics was, at one time, was overtly there. I mean, it was, you know, very clearly political imagery with political comment. And when I first moved over to Ireland, which was about 20 years ago, I came over because I wanted to do some work on Irish politics, and from a socialist perspective. And so I came over to sort of really to do some research to see how I could achieve that. And one thing I discovered when I came over was something that I'd never known before, but obviously most people in Ireland would know about, is the con, the prisoner's letter, written on cigarette papers. And I saw this as quite an interesting opportunity to look at that relationship between socialist politics and sort of Republican nationalist politics here. And so the con was kind of like a Republican form. But it gave, because it involved text, it gave me an opportunity to impose something else on it. So I was writing Marxist texts onto cigarette papers, and some of them were very big. I mean, obviously, prisoners' letters or any little things, but I did huge sheets made up of cigarette papers with tiny, tiny writing on. So, and so that was really how text started, and that went on to working directly onto gallery walls with text, incorporating images sometimes. And then that led on to a piece called Capital, which was a piece that preceded this exhibition, and where I took Karl Marx's Das Kapital, which is a huge book, 3-volume book, and wrote it onto 480 two-dimensional objects, which were then laminated. And so that was a big project. So that was like 2.5 years work doing that. And then that led on to this piece, but that came through looking at the actual, what Marx had written in Capital, and looking at how he described production processes and relationships between different types of commodity production. And then I applied his theory to ideas of 20th century, particularly art. And then in looking through that, through a long-winded process, I ended up deciding to make paintings of one painting of each of the 480 objects. So that's how the Capital paintings came about. So the politics is still there, but it's not sort of overtly so. I mean, no one can sort of come in here and see a political message. But one thing that is interesting about what David was saying about relationships between these things and sort of pulling and pushing things and changing, that's something that's very important to me. It's what socialists call dialectics, a dialectical approach to making art, where you're looking at contradictions, factors which contradict each other or complement each other, and clashing them together and see what happens. And I think that's one thing that I think would identify David and myself both equally in the way we approach making art.
Can you explain how these appeared onto the canvas and what was the process? Yeah.
Well, the process really is just that I took the original Capital pieces and they were all scanned onto the computer. So I had all 480 pieces of that work. And then I just printed them out from the computer, and then used the old-fashioned carbon paper. Remember carbon paper? Yeah. When we used to have typewriters. And so I just laid the printout onto the canvas with carbon paper behind and just traced over the original. Yeah. So I then had a drawing in blue line on the canvas. So basically I just produced a paint by numbers set for myself in a way, and then just so I had the original next to me, and just so to make sure the colours were right. Yeah. This is, I mean, of course this is the most appropriate one to talk about in a way, because this is the William Morris wallpaper. But what I found interesting about this one in a way, and in some of the others as well, was that because it's hand printed, block printed, what happens is you see where the ink kind of collects in certain places, and so you're having to paint all those little things as well. And so you're not just painting of the wallpaper, you're painting a different way of producing an image. And so I enjoyed that it's a painting of an ink print. Yes. And sort of having to sort of do that. So I think that was kind of an interesting. But that's basically the process, is tracing the printout. But I mean, that's another thing that's I find kind of interesting, in that all these paintings and paintings I've made since, and certainly for the next few paintings I make, they're all computer based. And so although they're made in a traditional way, oil paint on canvas, everything starts off in a computer. So everything is made on Photoshop before it's actually committed to canvas. And I kind of quite like that contradiction as well, that although I'm sort of gone back to tradition, I'm still using up-to-date computer software to arrive at the actual image myself. Doing this, I mean, because it was a new thing for me, and because it was 4 years' work, I mean, what's happened is that it's thrown up dozens of questions for me, So there are, I mean, some of them are sort of philosophical questions, are like the fact that you see that there's lots of blank canvas, and the blank canvas was from the transparent sheets that Capital was made in, and so it kind of represents, blank canvas means nothingness. And so there's sort of questions about how can you play around with representations of nothingness, So there's that sort of thing, but also this, again, referring back to what Dave was saying about sort of dialectics, and so it's sort of this question, these ideas about dialectical ways of making things, and so there's sort of thinking about how to construct an image in a way that involves that sort of clashing of contradictions. But also, well, things like copyright, of course. I mean, of course, because I'm using found objects, I've kind of violated quite a few copyrights there, you know. But that's something that's that kind of produced a few questions as well about ownership and the notions of what's the term, intellectual property. So I actually just did a series of paintings which were using free clip art, you know, computer clip art. Images, so that they're sort of copyright free. So now I've made a load of work that doesn't infringe any copyrights, but raises the questions of that sort of ownership.
I've been working with a guy called a Russian suprematist constructivist artist called Kazimir Malevich, he was very famous. He did the first white paintings and the first black squares in 1916, 1917. And then I discovered that this guy, avant-garde filmmaker, Hans Richter, had been doing very similar work in the 1920s in Germany. And Malevich actually saw his work at the Bauhaus in about 1925 and thought, I really like this guy's work, it's just like mine, I want to do a film with him. And Malevich had never done a film, because basically he was a painter and a sculptor. So he wrote a film script for Richter, and then Richter went on to develop it. And it's that storyboard that I use in my painting. The actual film was never made, but it's the storyboard I've used, and it's really about the first abstract film. So, but it was at the time it was a very revolutionary thing to do, because form, like simple shapes, then were very connected with radical politics. It was a sort of vanguardist politics and avant-garde art went together during that period. So that is why I have some sort of connectivity to it and why I was interested in it. And I was then interested in taking that sort of aesthetic and seeing what would happen when I put it into dialogue with all the flowery patterns of Morris, because that also has a sort of politics, a very utopian politics. Because, I mean, one of the ways that you can look at Morris's work, I mean, if you look at his designs, it's never winter. It's always summer. There's always fruit on the trees. They're always in leaf or they're always in flower.
Can you lead us through the process of just one of your 69 paintings today, please?
Well, this painting is painted on a William Morris pattern called Indian. And Morris actually copied this from Indian pattern design very, very closely. So it's nothing's original about this. Over it and around parts of it, I've painted this image from Hans Richter. And in the original Hans Richter, it was just a black and a red rectangle beside each other to make a square. So I've painted out some of the what you might call the background of the Morris design, just leaving the flowers and the stalk. So it almost looks like the flowers and the stalk are poking through the Hans Richter design. All the wallpapers here are in the order that they came out of the wallpaper book.
Right.
So that was predetermined. I kept that order.
Right.
And then the Richter image, that is actually the order in which it's on the storyboard. Right. So they just came together as a result of their number within the order. Okay. So the only decision I had to make was whether to paint what things to paint out and what things to leave. So that was the only aesthetic decision I had to make on any painting. Everything else was predetermined.
The show will run through to the 10th of May. and during which there'll be a number of talks and discussions. That last week of the exhibition, we're teaming up with ICTU, and we'll be hosting a discussion on the relevance of marks today, as a number of other sort of things will be happening as well.